Yeah, so to kick off the first episode of a new podcast, the Founders Podcast, the real purpose of it is obviously to talk about things that are important to us and likely other founders, especially Canadian-based founders. And as we get through multiple episodes, you'll definitely hear more about our backstory. So we won't waste your time with that right now. But we wanted to jump in with the first episode with something that's obviously quite pressing, which is the state of the Canadian government and how it will impact going forward, the priorities in the next year ahead, how it will impact citizens and business owners and other leadership. So with that, there was a few questions that we wanted to sort of touch on, all sort of centered around the likely successor to the current prime minister who's stepping down, Justin Trudeau, and that is Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party. And the polling numbers are pretty dramatic in his favor. I don't think that there's any risk in the next year, unless something really surprising happens, that he's going to be the one to form government and be the leader, the prime minister leader of the country. So a couple questions that wanted to chat about. So the first one was, what are the tasks at hand for the incoming leader? From our perspective, what would it take to at least challenge, if not, fix or solve some of those challenges? And finally, subjectively speaking, can he do it? Does he have what it takes to get it done? So I think I'll kick off. So, what are the tasks at hand? I think for me, the big one, and for most business owners and founders especially, is the clear economic challenges. And we can do it. We can get into the details on a bunch of other, subtopics in separate episodes. For example, the debt or the level of trade and stuff like that we're relying on right now in the U.S. But I think first and foremost for me, we're spending the government has spent a ton of money, and it hasn't produced anything worthwhile in the economy in terms of GDP growth. And that's really going to be kind of the top priority for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll chime in there, and excited to kick off this inaugural podcast here with you fine gentlemen. I guess the big thing that I think Pierre, in his platform, he's broached on the topic a number of times. It's inflation. So I think we can start talking about inflation, and just so everyone's aware, like we might have some non-Canadian listeners. And like the pronunciation of Pierre's name, no one can get this right. I couldn't get it right for the longest time. I've been corrected numerous occasions. Poilievre. So he goes by Pierre Poilievre. French name, that's not the proper French pronunciation of that name, but he says everyone calls him Poilievre. So just so we know, we got that straight now. And I'm going to try not to mess it up for the rest of this podcast. But let's talk about inflation and how bad it's become in Canada, and kind of what Pierre is saying he's going to do about it. I don't know. Do you want to start off, Andrew, or do you want me to jump into it?
You can just jump into it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, I guess, piggybacking off what Kyle said, government spending is at an all-time high. The deficit, the budget deficits are at all-time highs. I'm sure we could pull up some statistics if we had to, but this is in turn really fueling inflation. This is one of the main drivers that's fueling inflation in Canada, and the cost of living. I know what the number that they're putting out there, posting, versus what Canadians are feeling is very different. I think it's around 2% is what they're saying it is right now. Is that correct, guys?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're suggesting that it's coming closer to 2%. I think it's 2.5% or something like that.
Yeah, feels a lot higher. Feels a lot higher than that, and you feel it when you're going to the grocery stores, when you're going to the pumps, when you're looking to buy a house, any kind of capital assets you're looking to purchase as a business owner. You definitely feel that inflation. And I think Pierre's big thing is this pay as you go. I was listening to him a month ago, and he was talking about the pay as you go, where basically any kind of government spending, before they allocate any budget, any spending, the government would have to offset that new spending with budget cuts. So they would have to make cuts elsewhere that would be equivalent to what they're planning on spending. So that's been some of the things he's been talking about to curb government spending and curb the printing of money to fuel the deficit. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that one of the big thing is inflation. His economic policy, where it becomes really interesting, is that a lot of the things he's trying to do to reduce inflation involves cutting carbon taxes. His whole thing about axing the taxes. So by reducing and lowering the taxes, it would help support free enterprises in Canada, right? It's cutting the taxes for corporation, for example. These are going to lead to lower prices in our grocery stores, lower prices at the pump, and that I think is something that would help lower inflation for and cost for all of us.
And he's bullish on housing as well. Hey, Kyle, like he's really bullish on removing that red tape and the bureaucratic process for getting permits. All that red tape that goes with that, development charges, development fees. I'm not sure. Like Kyle's in Alberta, Andrew and I are in Ontario. Development fees have reached an all-time high. They're completely outrageous, and these prices end up trickling their way back down to the consumer. If a builder has to pay these insane amounts of development fees and costs, they're going to price that into the house prices. So that's something that Pierre has been speaking a lot about as well. Like, do you think, is he going to put his money where his mouth is and actually be able to deliver these things? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, so I just to come back to the housing piece, I think it's really interesting. I think he actually spoke about this with a recent podcast he did with Jordan Peterson, where he said people that work in Toronto are essentially receiving the equivalent of half the wage if you compare it to the U.S. dollars for someone working in Chicago. So if you did the conversion, yet the residents of Chicago, the cost of housing is half. So they're essentially making twice the money with half the housing cost. And he said the same thing for Vancouver to Seattle. So I think the inflation is definitely part of that, but on the housing front and a lot of the ability to develop, business owners that are trying to grow and trying to spend money. Another big problem that he will have a difficult time addressing himself is Canada trails the G7 OECD nations in capital investment. And so what that typically means is that money that's invested today is revenue and growth tomorrow. And so we've been lagging in that metric for almost 20 years now. And it should be no surprise that our economy is not growing. We're 30% behind the US from where we were on parity roughly 10, 15 years ago. Actually 10 years ago, just before Justin Trudeau came into power. So, we're not, we need to sort of keep an eye on those KPIs because those really sort of indicate what direction we're headed in. And the piece about housing is important because if we're losing, people, if we're not able to compete and we're losing people because the cost of living is so high and our wages are so deflated, there's absolutely no way that people are going to move here. People are going to stay here. And that's going to have a massive drag, obviously, on the economy as a whole. So I think those go sort of hand in hand. And the other piece that I think he can control and is part of that solution when it comes to red tape and regulation. I think what they are doing in the US with the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency is well overdue for most Western countries. I think, cutting tape and the level of bureaucracy Canada has, it's something crazy, like 25% of our total workforce is public sector. Like 1 in 4 employees is public sector. And so we really need to ask ourselves, are we getting value for money? If we're spending the tens of billions of dollars that we are, is that actually having a positive, accretive effect on the things that matter to us and the things that the government should be involved with? And if they shouldn't be involved, then we should essentially cut that regulation. We should cut that red tape and allow businesses to get on with it when and where possible.
Yeah, I think you touched on a bunch of really good topics that we could dive deep into there. Definitely one being, the public sector, how big it is, and how many working Canadians end up going that route, and how it affects private enterprise, and how private enterprise is competing for employees with public sector jobs. But before we dive into that, I wanted to just, something that Andrew's passionate about is, you talked about the capital expenditures in Canada being, much lower than our counterparts in the US. And Kyle, does that have something to do with a lot of Canadian dollars flowing into the US from here? Basically, Canadians and Canadian enterprise making investments into the US? Is it because of the returns they're getting there? Why aren't those capital expenditures happening here in Canada?
It's a really good question. And I think you guys are actually a good example of the opposite, because you as founders have said, we're going to take on the risk and we're going to spend money to invest in technology and in processes and changes that our counterparts and the contemporaries are not doing. And so I think that's what we want to see more of, is businesses, and technology is kind of the most obvious one, but it really comes down to, like equipment, new lines of business, whatever you want to call it. But essentially people spending money, investing in their business for our potential future payout. And I think the cynical view that I would have is that Canadians are, first and foremost, very risk averse, incredibly risk averse. So much so that it is absolutely paralyzing to the general national economy that we don't want to try new things. We really don't pioneer a whole lot here. We're definitely far further down the adoption curve than most nations. I would argue the US is probably at the very front of that curve, where a new technology, something like AI comes out. I think most companies in that marketplace are quite quick to adopt it. Whereas we, generally speaking, socially, we're quite risk averse. And I think the other thing that's kind of catching up with us is we don't do a terribly good job of selling or exporting. And I think, and this kind of comes back to something that I was going to talk about next in terms of what it would take to fix this from the government. And that is, we don't really compete. And our big companies have never really needed to compete. If we look at banking or, any sort of major industry, it's a fairly small number of companies, an oligopoly that's protected via scale and regulation and so forth. And so they really don't need to do anything to compete. They kind of, they mop up 20, 30% of the market every year. And there's really no impetus for them to compete. So they don't have to invest in anything. So I think those are kind of driving factors. And also by virtue of the fact that there has been a real lack of founders, a lack of entrepreneurship that has stayed north of the border, that's really where you see that spending, is you see early stage companies or innovation that comes out and says, hey, we want to invest in this. We want to sell it. We want Canadians to adopt this. And I think we're quite poor generally in our track record versus, a company moving to the US or selling to a larger incumbent in the US.
Yeah, Mike, you really touch on a topic that's resonate well with me, and I think it's this one topic that I can probably talk about for quite a while. I think if you look at the top 100 company in Canada, most of them are consist of what? Like you guys are aware, right? Like most of them are oil and gas, and banking. And my question is, our top. Like I think within our top 10, all the big banks are within our top 10. So Mike, at that scale, for our top 10 companies in Canada, and for the big banks are in there, what are we producing that is of value that we're selling off? It's a service. The banks are traditionally good at managing money and holding money, right? And they're not producing anything of value. But if you look into the US, the S&P 500, very well diversified. They have tech, they have manufacturing, they have oil and gas, they have banking, very well diversified. So
there's not one bank in the Magnificent Seven in the US. In the Magnificent Seven, there's not one bank in there. You're right.
Exactly. So, and what are they producing? They're producing products that are being utilized in the world. Like you look at Nvidia, you look at some of these like AMD, basically the rise of demand of these semiconductors are at an all-time high. They're basically trying to bring a lot of the manufacturing back into the country so that they can now produce for the world again. And within Canada, we don't see that within the top 10, top 100 companies. So we're not producing anything of value. right? And that's number one. And number two, to the point that you've said, Kyle, about entrepreneurship in Canada, there's a lack of first of all, a lack of funding from VCs. Like there's not much funding that happens in Canada that promotes entrepreneurship in our country, right? Like in our country, they essentially are investing in growth, like established revenue generating companies. Those are not taking on risk like in the US where they're betting on the next frontier, right? They're betting on blockchain, they're betting on AI, they're betting on these things that are gonna essentially reap a lot of benefit for them, right? They're taking these risks. But in Canada, you're right, we're not taking much risk. We're deterring a lot of entrepreneurship by imposing taxes. So one of the big things that happened last year, you guys know the 66% inclusion rate. That drives a ton of opportunities away from Canada. And when you talk about it, is this really only taxing corporation and the wealthy? No, of course not. It's basically a tax on everybody because that tax is going to trickle down to the consumer like us. In one way or another.
What that tax is, just so our listeners are aware, you're talking about the capital gains.
The capital gains, yeah, exactly. The capital gains, 66% inclusion rate now instead of the 50% that it was at for forever. And what's interesting is, I don't think that law is passed now. I don't think that law is passed. So it's a little bit in limbo right now until the new government comes in. So
right? Parliament being closed down.
Partly because they from what I've heard, is that, like this law was supposed to be passed, right? It's supposed to go through, Parliament and all that stuff. And this law is supposed to pass and become law. But because of the resignation, of Chrystia Freeland and then now Justin Trudeau, is sitting in limbo until someone can pass this into law. But the CRA obviously have to go with whatever that existing rule is right now. So they will implement the new rule, but technically that new rule is not passed into law yet. So this and what's interesting is that the next tax cycle for us is in April, whereas right now you don't know what rule you're supposed to be using. Right. So technically they're going to go by the new rule, but then what happened if that law doesn't get passed? So does that mean that now CRA owes taxes to all these people that have paid extra on their taxes? That's going to be a very interesting scenario. I think these are the kind of things that are happening right now that hopefully Pierre is going to come in and change it and promote entrepreneurship again. Right. So that I think is going to have an impact on enterprises.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point, which also kind of dovetails with another major issue that the Canadian government and country of Canada is dealing with. So because we no longer have a functioning parliament, we can't pass legislation like you're speaking about, and a very consequential tax bill that's sitting in limbo. And like our tax authority has essentially said, we need to act as though it's going to be passed because it's a massive change. And we've essentially told everybody, how to deal with it and how to report on it. And we anticipate we're going to collect it. Unless, by the end of March, which is when Parliament returns, they're not successful in passing that legislation. Now, I don't believe that bill requires a vote of confidence in the House. So I don't believe that bill is enough to bring down the government if the opposition parties don't vote for it. But most importantly, if the parties don't, essentially the parties that would vote against the government, they can essentially stop the bill. But until we have an election, which is not due to take place until October, and there's absolutely nothing forcing the government until there's a vote of no confidence that they lose, which may not happen. There's nothing otherwise that would force the government to have an election and for us to have a new prime minister. So it's very possible that legislation just sits in limbo along with a bunch of other pieces of legislation until the election, or they're able to pass it. So this is another problem with this proroguing of Parliament, that it just sort of stops the country dead. But one of the other big pressing matters that a lot of people are quite concerned about, I think legitimately, is the threats from Donald Trump. And if he comes into power on January 20th, which is a little over a week away, and he has promised to implement 25% tariffs on Canadian exports across the map. And we have a government in the sense that we have ministers that are still working, but we do not have a parliamentary, essentially operating system. And so they're able to obviously interface and talk to their counterparts and so forth and lobby, but there's no ways that we can pass legislation, as we just spoke about. And so a big concern, I think it's again a legitimate concern, is that if Donald Trump comes to power on January 20th and implements these tariffs, it will have an absolutely devastating impact on the Canadian economy. There's absolutely no way, around that. The vast majority, over 75%, I believe, of our economic exports go to the U.S. And it will absolutely devastate the economy. The inability for us to deal with that is a massive challenge. The inability for us to actually pass legislation or work constructively is a huge impediment. So that's another major task at hand for the current, if not the next government, is how to deal with the U.S. And I personally feel like it's mainly a negotiating tactic. I think that there's, that's sort of the stick. And I do think that there's going to be a bit of a carrot at the end of it. And we can do other episodes, for example, on some of the work that Kevin O'Leary is doing and stuff like that. But I do believe that it's really a negotiating tactic to try and get something from Canada, either more spending on defense, again, improving the border security, helping align the strategies in terms of immigration or whatever. I think it's mainly a negotiating tactic. And as long as we play ball and try and meet in the middle, I think we'll be fine.
Trump's a businessman, and we've seen him deploy these tactics before. He postures, he comes in hard right at the onset with the demands, and then he almost puts the counterparty on the defense where they're trying to meet these demands. So there's been a lot of talk, about this, the 25% tariff, also about, the 51st state or the economic union. So there's been lots of this circulating, in the news, mainstream media, also on social media. I follow Donald Trump, and he's been posting pictures of Canada with the U.S. flag on it. So Trump's doing a lot of this because it's exactly what you said, Kyle. Like he has an agenda. It's not just for fun. He's coming in hard, and then he's going to want something in return in order to now lift these proposed tariffs, which never existed to begin with, but he's created them. So now Canada has to bend to his will or try to negotiate the terms. And in the end, it's going to be favorable terms. But it's like you said, it's going to do with the borders, with immigration. Canada's already taken some action on immigration. I'm not going to get into it because that's another topic, but there's already been changes on certain visas they've been offering. So when Trump comes in with this hard approach, he usually gets results, and he's done it with other countries, other partners, and this is what he does to make deals happen. It's all like a big business deal. Trump's operating it like.
Yeah, do you think if the tariff actually get passed and it actually gets implemented, what do you guys think will happen in terms of our economy? Like, what are the best and worst case scenario in your opinion for 2025?
It's a really interesting question, and I think actually it's an important question that we as a country really need to ask ourselves, because it kind of reminds me of, I think we've all had clients, or the potential to have a client where they may have the vast majority of their revenue, or even us as startups, the vast majority of our revenue coming from one customer. It's incredibly difficult, and we see that risk from miles away, and you don't ever want to be in a position where the existence of your company is dependent on one customer or one provider of revenue. And we've had this problem for a long time, and we've never really talked about it. We've never really addressed, what are the consequences if that revenue disappears because, for example, they're starting to produce a lot of their own commodities themselves. But I think the best case scenario is, again, it forces us to be competitive. It forces us to say, okay, well, we can't sell it south of the border, easily and cheaply. We have to spend more time and more effort trying to export it, marketing goods and services around the world. And to be fair, there's a lot of industries that have been doing a very good job of this. Like I was talking with somebody this week about canola oil, and canola oil's pretty common, and most people don't sort of pay it a second thought. But canola oil is a Canadian-derived, genetically modified rapeseed oil that was marketed as, I believe it stands for low acidic or low acid canola oil. Sorry, Canadian oil. And so, that's sort of the initiative and that's gone on for decades. I don't know when that initially started, but, our companies need to do a better job. Our industries need to do a better job of actually marketing goods and services beyond just the US. And I think the best case scenario is if we do, it's going to be a hard shock, but I think it would force us to look beyond our North American borders and also look at derivative products and services that those far-flung countries and societies actually want, that we're really not looking at because we haven't needed to.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough because the U.S. is such a massive economy. They're so close. There's been, like you said, it's been relatively inexpensive to export there, and they're just so similar to us in terms of culture and going to exporting now, trying to export products to Asia, to the Africas, to the Latin Americas, the Europes. I'm no expert on export, but I'm sure it'd be a whole different problem to solve. Much different.
Well, I think it's just, it comes back to that point, right? Like essentially entrepreneurship that in Canada needs to ramp up a little bit here. Like I think Canada is in a great position to take on some of these major industries. Think about it, like if Taiwan can create, and become the center of the world on semiconductor, Canada has a lot of natural resources. Canada has a lot of industries where it's situated has a lot of land, and it's relatively central that it can probably produce and have access to a lot of other countries that it can export.
Andrew's right, resources for sure, but historically Canada hasn't been super bullish on the exportation of their resources. Like we're sitting on so much forestry, water, fresh water, lithium, but I just oil.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the solution that needs to be implemented in order to reduce the inflation. I think I remember Pierre actually brought up this example, and I thought it was a great example. Is think of the apple tree, right? If if the government keep printing money, and there's 10 apples, and there's $10 out there, and now you just essentially reduce the number of apples, it's going to get more costly, right? Or you print more money, it's going to be more costly, right? So you have to produce more apples. And that's the idea, is that Canada needs to essentially come together, start building industries, start building things of value and producing that for the world. And that's their own way.
Becoming more of a consumer of its own products.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point too, because we actually are a better trading partner with the US than we are internally. So we generate, again, more revenue. Every single province generates more revenue trading south. And that's, again, it's a big market, but we do not have strong ties, and we have a very different commonwealth compared to the system in the US in terms of, governance and so forth. So there's no sort of easy way to force provinces to work together. Whereas in the US, there's a lot more control from the federal system. But we, again, voluntarily, to your point, Andrew, from an entrepreneur's perspective, we need to forge those ties. We need to do a better job of saying, let's try and buy local. Let's try and find and source supply chains that are local and work with one another rather than taking the easy route.
Exactly.
Take a page out of the US's book. The reason Trump is doing this, it's short-term pain. A lot of businesses in the US aren't happy about this either, because now all of a sudden their supply of goods is gonna dwindle down. So now, when they're outsourcing parts from neighboring countries, components, widgets, it's going to be a lot more pricey to receive those, or difficult to get them now, which is going to put pressure on them to manufacture and look inwards. and create jobs and manufacturing inward. So it's a long-term solution, but I think Canada needs, just like you and Andrew both mentioned, Canada needs to do the same thing.
Yeah, like if you look at, like I think COVID really kind of, shed some light into this issue, right? Of having being reliant on other countries to manufacture some really critical components. Like we saw with the chips. And when the chip shortage happened, that had massive impact on many different businesses, increase inflation across the board because there's a shortage in vehicle, in machinery, computers, this and that. And why is that the case? Because all of the chip making has all been outsourced outside of the U.S. Right?
It's tough to compete, Andrew, with Asia, with China, and I think a lot of it has to do with first off, their labor costs are so much lower. Second off, there's lots of government funding. Like a lot of these manufacturers, these large manufacturers in China, they're being
It's
funded by the government.
Well, the thing is, it is yeah, like the chip making is in Taiwan, right? And I think, listen, the TSMC has tried to set up set up a base in Arizona, right? Have you guys heard about that? Like how they wanted to set up shop in Arizona, and the issue is the skilled worker. There's not enough of these individuals that know how to make chips because it is kind of specialized, right? And what ended up happening is that they're not willing to bring in some of these workers to train the local because the engineering U.S. is so good at engineering chips. They're so good at that, but they ended up outsourcing the lower level, the manufacturing part of these chips to Taiwan, and now there's nobody here that knows how to make these chips, and and they don't have the machinery, like all of that to actually build the chips, and this causes a shortage. And now all the big chip companies trying to essentially go back to the U.S. and trying to do it is going to take years. It's going to take years to actually happen.
Government is a lot bigger in our Western states, in Canada and the U.S. There's lots of bureaucracy, like we talk about. There's lots of tariffs. There's lots of fees and costs and bureaucracy involved with manufacturing in the U.S. and in Canada. And I think in some of these other countries, and I'm no expert but from what I've seen out there, there's a lot more support from the government. A lot, they basically, they empower them to build, they fund them, they support them. There's a lot of stimulus involved for these businesses to manufacture product in a lot of these Asian countries. So I don't know, how do we compete with that?
Yeah, I think we don't. Like, I'll offer the contrarian perspective here, and I don't think that we want that type of work. I think we need to look at comparative advantage and say, do we want to try and compete on low cost labor? That's typically been outsourced to Asia for the last 20 years. And to be fair, they're the best at it. They have tooling, they have, scale, they have all of the stuff that they need to be very good at it. And to your point, the governments have done an amazing job in terms of trying to protect those industries with, subsidies and financing and so forth, where even if we wanted to, and we immediately tomorrow had the workforce and the wherewithal to do it, our products wouldn't be competitive on the open market because they're still subsidizing the cost. So I think we need to be a bit more strategic in terms of what has the best upside and what should we be focusing our attention on in order to potentially provide for our kids' generation or whatever down the road. What is that sort of high value, those high value economies and industries where if we can implement, let's say 10% or 5% of global market share in Canada, it's going to be irrelevant how much, the labor cost is because it's so, minuscule compared to the total value. So an example is Germany's been very good and the technology behind TSMC, the lithography technologies, I believe out of Holland, a Dutch company. Anyways, they are the single source supply of the manufacturing technology, the production technology that creates those chips. And so I can guarantee you engineers and thousands of people that work for that company, saving an extra, couple dollars an hour is the furthest thing from what they're concerned with. They're selling billions of dollars worth of technology where the labor cost is not, it's a rounding error. Same thing for Germany. So Germany has traditionally been very good at exporting engineering, machinery, production machinery, let's say CNC, fabrication, that kind of stuff. And that has been very, very high value. And more importantly, if they've used it in other jurisdictions, let's say a consultant that's helping an Asian manufacturer, that Asian manufacturer is paying, dollars from their economy into the German economy because of that knowledge transfer. So I do think we need to be a bit more strategic. I don't think we want to be chasing low cost, volume type labor plays, because I just don't think we're ever going to be able to compete. I don't think we're going to get anywhere close to winning it. But also I think it's kind of missing the point that if we want to create value, we want the economy, we want people to be employed in indispensable high value jobs that have high salaries that are, protected from competition. That comes from again, specific industries that provide a lot of high value. And one example, we can do a podcast on it in the future, but one example that comes to mind is this new AI stuff. And there's a lot of different, it's not just writing code for running or training large language models. Like there's a lot of infrastructure that goes on behind the scenes. And again, coming back to the Kevin O'Leary project called Wonder Valley, that is going to take a lot of very educated, very resourceful, high value people to build and maintain and scale that type of project. So I think we need to be focusing and have a conversation around where do we want to be going.
But like, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Kyle. Like, in a country that has a lot of high value, like high, intelligent workforce, high skilled, who's going to be doing, like, I guess some of the lower skilled work, right? Like, isn't that what got us into this trouble in the first place, because we offshore all of our manufacturing and retain this higher intelligent or high skilled workforce within the country. Like now we don't have the capability, we don't have the machinery, we don't have the supply chain to even manufacture anything anymore. Isn't that what got us into this trouble in the first place?
Yeah, I think that there's a very valid argument there, which is dependency. Like if you look at, for example, national security. So I know one thing that's top of mind in the US is the supply of military equipment, including things like drones that are manufactured by China, specifically China. And the reason that that's obviously an exposure and a risk is that if they go to war with China, there's a massive, attack vector, if you call it that, with that supply chain. So first and foremost, they could cut it off. They could cut off supply, which they would. They're not going to be selling parts or components to their adversary. But secondly, what other sort of damage could they do via that supply chain? So I think that's a very valid argument. You want to make sure that if you have a supply chain, it's protected, it's diversified, and you're limiting that risk as much as possible. However, if there's an opportunity, like I don't think the answer to that is to onshore absolutely every job, because there's still going to be, US to Mexico, for example, or Canada to Mexico, there's definitely going to be efficiencies and comparative advantage for us to trade with Mexico and have Mexican workers doing a certain task, whether it be assembly or whatever, that is a lower cost task compared to what we want to do. If in a perfect world, if we could choose one or the other, we would want to do high value stuff, and we would want everybody in our economy to be doing high value stuff. Now, if we can't source it securely and there's too much risk associated with it, the other part of that question is actually very pertinent, because it is essentially, well, how do we solve that? If we have to make something at a loss or we're not going to be competitive, what is the best way to do it? A lot of people would probably suggest something like robotics, technology, AI, that kind of stuff, where there's going to be, I would predict, a huge boom in robotics automated manufacturing in the US for that exact purpose, because they simply don't have or don't want the low value, low cost labor, but they still want to have the supply. They still want to have the ability to produce at least intermediary parts or critical components for some of those end products.
Exactly. So I think it comes down to the critical components, and the reason why I think the chip discussion is so interesting is because the U.S. government clearly saw that this is a massive exposure for them, so they created the CHIPS Act, right? And I think this, if Canada explores the opportunities to integrate into the North American semiconductor supply chain, and leverage either our knowledge or some sort of resources that we have here, that is going to basically be that's going to position Canada to be a critical player in this whole supply chain, right? So I think it's a big opportunity, and with AI, is the demand for these things are going to be significantly higher. So it's a big opportunity that I think Canada should be looking into for sure.
So the big opportunity here is AI on the skilled labor side, and the chips on the manufacturing side, and some of the resources we have. But yeah, I guess what, Andrew, you're not trying to say that Canada should become a manufacturing superpower of all kinds of products. You're identifying an opportunity. And I think that makes more sense, because obviously you can't be great at everything, and we have to hang our shingle and our hat somewhere. And I think civilizations were built upon trade. Like, you can't be great at everything, and every civilization that has come to be has grown into prominence because of their trade partners. They, for example, they might have specialized in grain harvesting. I'm just going really back now, and they had other neighboring, civilizations, other neighboring trade partners that were specialists in something else, such as harvesting meat. So like we can't be great at everything. And there will be a lot of inefficient, like, weaknesses in certain areas, and we need to rely somewhat on our trade partners. It'll always be a weakness. It's always an Achilles heel, because if that trade partner, if that supply chain shut down, as in what they're talking about with China and the U.S., I heard about that too, Kyle, about the drones. But we can't be great at everything. So maybe this is something we can be great in. Getting into the semiconductors, getting into the chips. I think that's an opportunity that Canada, you're right, Canada should be exploring.
It's because chips are so integral in everything we're doing. We saw that exposure, that as soon as there's no chips, you see that everything pretty much stops. There's no cars. You can't buy anything, and everything slows down. If there's no supply of things to buy, it also causes an increase in inflation. Right. So it's just that I think recognizing some of these manufacturing opportunities is both an opportunity and something that I think is essential and necessary for our defense as well. Right. We don't want to offshore some of these critical components.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's bring it back to sort of the final topic, which is, does he have, or does Pierre Poilievre have what it takes to take on some of these challenges of specifically what we spoke about in terms of what would it take, and does he have what it takes to make a change, and can he actually make a change? So how much can the federal government actually impact these things, and how much of it really falls on individuals like us and society as a whole?
Look, we're never going to know exactly what one man is capable of. There's going to be a lot, he could talk up a mean game, but when he comes into power, that's when it's a true testament to see what they're actually capable of. I think a lot of it's going to have to do with Parliament as well, and the number of seats that the Conservatives hold. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a majority government by the sounds of it on both ends. So that'll give them more control to make changes. Canadians are looking for some substantial change based on the individuals I speak to, but we'll never know. Pierre's he's a career politician. He's very good at his job. He knows what to say. He's definitely the best choice right now for Canadians. Some people may argue that, but based on what's out there and his platform and what he wants to do for regular, everyday working Canadians, it seems like it's positive, in my opinion. But does he have what it takes? There's been a lot of deficit. There's been a lot of spending. The debt's at an all-time high. I think he's definitely going to have his hands full. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, like I'm gonna just, I guess, sum it up. I think, based on what he's basically speaking about, axing the taxes, that's his statement, and I agree with him. It's, that's going to be a big part of it. It's reducing taxes, stimulating free enterprises, getting businesses to grow, and that's essentially gonna help us get out of this mess that we're in right now. right? With high government spending, high printing of money, we're spending too much money on bureaucracy, red tape, consultants, foreign aid, all kinds of things, right? And I think these are the areas that can really be looked into, reduced, and going back to what makes a country great, right? It's the enterprises, it's the corporation, the jobs, it all comes down to these entrepreneurs who are growing businesses, successful businesses that are employing hundreds and thousands of people. And that's what we need to promote, and that's what he's saying in his platform. So I think it's going to be positive there. But like Mike says, he's a career politician. We got to see what actually happened and what actually get passed and how fast these things move through legislation. So it's going to be interesting to see if it's going to be a change or not. But definitely what he's saying makes sense and definitely resonate with the working class like me.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd double down on what you both said. I think he will have the mandate. I think that's important, that he obviously has the votes to sort of direct him to do the things that we would like him to do. And I think he will have a majority in the House. And secondly, I do think that he has access, like you say, to the levers, the big levers that will make an impact. And I think that's enough to start to right the ship. And then, obviously everybody has a part to play, but I do think that he as a career politician is never going to make any dramatic changes. He's never going to do anything the same way that Donald Trump would do that would really risk, adverse reactions or voter sort of animosity. But I do think that he still has the power to make some dramatic changes, and he's prepared to make those changes that will have a positive impact on all of these things going forward. But I do think after that happens, I think once he kind of rights the ship or the direction starts to change, I do think these sorts of conversations are important. I think as a society, a sort of, nonpartisan way, government needs to talk to the population, and the population really needs to have a dialogue around what we want to be targeting. What is the goal for the next year, 5 years, 10 years? What do we really want to be doing? Because I think if there's one major criticism that I would have for the last government, there really wasn't any direction in terms of what is the identity of Canada? What, as a country and as multiple provinces, what should we be aiming at? And I think if we have a goal and we have a clear direction, I think it gets a lot easier for people to focus on that target.
Yeah, and you said it earlier, the legislation in Canada is very fragmented with how our political system works. So a lot of it comes down to the provincial. A lot of decisions and lawmaking does come down to the provincial and sometimes municipal level. So Kyle's absolutely right. We need Canadians, once Pierre gets in, if he does get in, he's not going to have the pen to do anything he wants. A lot of it will come down to the provincial, municipal level. So he'll still need lots of support from his constituents. And I don't know why I can't say that word right now, but he'll need lots of support. And like you said, the Canadians will have to get really behind where they want to go and really give that support back and really urge the government to make changes at all levels to make a difference.
All right. That's pretty much it. Any final thoughts before we wrap? Andrew, what's the key takeaway here?
That's it from me.
Okay, very nice.
I think, no, sorry guys. I think my internet is a little bit of an issue.
That's all right. It's at the right time, so we can break perfectly for your internet. But no, we'll call that a wrap. Thanks all for listening, and we look forward to chatting more on the next episode and delving a bit more depth in some of these topics. So we'll talk to you guys then.
Sweet. Thanks, guys.